Chapter 10. The Quiet Library. Morning arrived with a soft gray sky that seemed to speak gently at the window panes, and Aiden woke with the feeling of a cup held between two hands, warm and steady, the way a day feels when it begins without hurry. The lantern they had found at the market rested on a shelf in the cafe now, and its name whispered through his thoughts the way a kind word travels. Light found together, and the phrase kept a small circle of calm around his chest as he rose and brewed tea. The cutting on the sill drifted in its clear water with roots that looked a little longer than yesterday, and he murmured a greeting as if the plant could hear a promise and trust it. A faint scent of rain reached the room before the first drop touched the street. A clean smell like wet stone and new paper, and he smiled at the chance to move slowly. He placed his sketchbook in his satchel with a folded card for the cafe board and a worn library card he had been given during his first week in town. He had not spoken much about the old library on the hill, but he loved it in the way one loves a house that remembers many stories. Today seemed made for that room, and he hoped that after breakfast he and Mira might climb the short lane to its door and let the rain rest around them while pages turned like soft waves. When he reached the cafe, the bell gave its friendly note and the owner lifted a hand in greeting. The lantern sat on the shelf near the board with a gentle presence even unlit, its pale wood calm against the fern leaves, the small square of blue in the glass taking what little light the cloudy morning offered and keeping it as if to show what patience can do. Aiden pinned his card that said the market of small wonders lives warmly in the mind and set a pressed petal on the pin, then drank chamomile while the window grew freckled with rain. Mira arrived with her canvas bag and a braid that held the ease of a day with no demand. She shook a few drops from her sleeve and laughed softly at the way the bell tried to sound cheerful even in such weather. They spoke in low voices about the market and about the lantern maker with the long braid who had spoken to the children as if time were a kind teacher. Then Aiden asked if she might like to walk to the library and read while the rain found its shape. Mira smiled with the simple relief of a plan that sounds like a blanket, and said yes at once, that she had a list of plant guides to borrow and a quiet wish to hear him read a few pages of something calm. They finished their tea and stepped into the soft shower under a single umbrella, an old one the owner kept by the door, and made their way along the lane that climbed past the bookshop and a row of houses that smelled of toast. The library waited within a brick building with white steps and a door that had learned to welcome without any show. The sign above the door had faded letters that looked like an old friend more than a decoration, and a bell inside gave the sound of a teacup touched by a spoon when the door opened. They stepped in and the rain settled behind them like a coat hung on a peg. The room held the quiet of patient work, a silence that was not empty but full of soft sounds if one took time to hear them, the small whisper of pages, the creak of a wooden table when someone shifted, the low hum of a clock that wanted to be helpful but not noticed. Light fell through high windows in a gentle way that made dust look like interest rather than neglect. The librarian looked up from a cart of books and smiled with the sort of welcome that does not rearrange the room. She nodded toward a side alcove where two comfortable chairs sat near a narrow table and a lamp with a shade the color of sweet cream. Aiden and Mira thanked her and left their umbrella to drip in a stand near the door. In the alcove, the chairs faced a tall shelf that held a mix of novels with softened spines, essay collections with tidy jackets, and a row of slim volumes bound in linen, the kind that often contain letters or short reflections on the shape of a day. Mira ran her finger along the linen spines and pulled out a book whose title promised a season of evenings at a seaside town, and Aiden smiled at the mirror of their own days in the name. He chose a second book with quiet illustrations and words about how to keep a room gentle. They sat, the chairs accepting them with a small sigh of wood and cushion, and the rain made a steady kindness against the windows. For a while they only read to themselves in the way two people can share a room and let the sound of pages serve as a conversation. Aiden liked the way Mira turned pages, careful but not precious, and he thought how that small motion held the same attention he had seen when she checked a leaf or turned a flower pot to catch a better light. After a time she lowered her book and asked if he might read aloud. He nodded and opened the small essay book whose chapters were the length of a cup of tea, and he began with a piece about time learning to sit, and the shape of his voice found the pace of the room. His voice was grounded and easy, the way warm water feels in a bowl, and the sentences arranged themselves without tangles. The essay spoke of a man who had moved to a quiet town and watched the clock in the square for a full hour without doing anything else, and how at first he felt guilt because the city hung expectation on his shoulders, but how the feeling changed into something like permission when he noticed that the pigeons did their work and the clouds did their work and the clock itself did its work without any need for him to hurry. Aiden read slowly and clearly, and Mira leaned back and closed her eyes so that the images could move across her mind without having to be chased. Rain made a soft drum on the roof. The lamp shade fed warm light to the table and the armrests. The scent in the room was a mix of old paper and lemon oil and the wool of sweaters drying. Aiden's voice went on, and the essay told a story of time standing quietly still for a moment when the lighthouse beam in the writer's memory seemed to pause on a wave even though it had not, because the heart sometimes wants a second to look more closely. Myra's breathing slowed in a way he recognized from the greenhouse bench and from the dune path sand. He read another page and spoke of how a person can place a little candle of attention inside a minute and let it become a gentle room, and of how this does not steal time but returns it to a kindness that rush cannot find. He glanced over and saw that her eyes remained closed and that her mouth wore a soft line that meant deep comfort, and he let the next sentence fall into the quiet with a patience that matched the clock. The librarian rolled a cart past the alcove without looking in and then disappeared into a row of shelves because she knew when a good stillness was growing. Aiden turned another page and the story spoke of rain drifting down a window and refusing to hurry once it found a path, and he smiled at the echo of their walk here. He read of a tea shop where two friends shared silence without apology and felt more rested for the shared space. And he felt in his body the way the day lay around them like a blanket that knew how to cover only to the chin. Mira's head tipped a small measure toward the chair back. He adjusted nothing about his voice except to lean a little closer so the sound would not have to travel far. He thought of the lantern on the cafe shelf and of the ring of jars on the clock tower, and he realized that reading aloud felt like the same work, the placing of one small light in a place where someone else could see better. He kept his breath low and steady and chose a second essay with small chapters about quiet rooms and the ways a day finds its shape when one listens more than one speaks. He read a passage in which a man described learning how to wind the old library clock by counting heartbeats and not by watching the minute hand, and how the act made the same number of turns change from duty to care. Mira's shoulder relaxed. Aiden rolled the thought around in his chest and let it settle like a stone at the bottom of a clear bowl. He shifted to a short story about a traveler who finds an inn where time seems to stand still because each person there refuses to hurry another person, and the traveler falls asleep to the sound of a book closing and nothing else. The paragraphs were simple and the images familiar enough to rest the mind. The lamps in the inn were steady. The floorboards spoke when someone passed and then rested. The wind moved around the eaves like calm hands. Mira's breathing slowed further, the kind of slow that keeps company with trust. He paused only to turn the page and then continued, because he liked how the words seemed to smooth themselves into a path for her to walk into sleep. He read of a small library very much like this one where the tables were friendly and the chairs understood long afternoons, and about how a librarian learned the names of people by the way they turned a page, and about a cat that slept in the returns basket because warm books made a kind nest. And he laughed softly in his chest when a small shape slipped across the doorway but did not enter, as if the library wanted to agree with the page and produce a cat without making a show. Outside, the rain deepened for a few moments and then returned to its earlier pace, and the windows showed beads that gathered and ran in neat paths. Aiden spoke on, choosing instructions for rest without naming them as instructions. He spoke of rooms that help people slow down, rooms like greenhouses and cafes and clock towers and old libraries with high windows, and he changed the names in the essay to the names of their town without telling the book he had done so. He read of Waverly Bay as if the author had known it, and he felt the ease of honesty in his chest. He described in the words of the story a lantern with a square of blue that asked nothing but offered presents, and an evening when townspeople lit small jars so others could find their way, and a morning market where careful hands shared goods to nourish and delight. The story did not mind that he had made it local. It seemed to be a wide river that agreed to flow where kindness placed it. He looked again at Mira and found her asleep in the chair with her hands folded at her lap and the corner of the linen-bound book resting like a small bird against her thigh. He let his voice soften even more and chose one last passage that said time can stand still without stopping, that stillness is not a door closed but a window held open so air can move slowly through a room and make it new. And he let the last words close the circle of the hour. He sat for a long moment and listened to the rain and to her breath and to the clock that had lowered its own voice in respect. He did not want to move his chair and risk waking her, so he reached for his sketchbook and made a drawing with minimal lines. He drew the curve of her shoulder where it met the chair, the small lift at the corner of her mouth that showed her rest, the angle of the lamp shade, the shape of the book against her dress, the square cut of the window where rain made a soft drift. He wrote beneath the drawing, "Time learned to sit," and felt the rightness of the words like warm tea. The librarian appeared with soundless feet and set a second lamp on the table so that the light would remain even if the first one dimmed, and Aiden thanked her with a nod. The librarian glanced at Mira with a look that was not curiosity but simple kindness, then left the alcove and returned to her tasks. Aiden turned his mind carefully toward the world outside their chairs and considered the path back through town when the rain lifted. He pictured the cafe with its lantern and the way the blue glass would catch late afternoon light, and he pictured the greenhouse where the frame waited like a patient instrument. He did not wish to hurry the waking. He closed his eyes for a few breaths and listened to the sound of a page turning somewhere in the middle aisles. An hour passed with the peaceful certainty of a full tide. At last Mira stirred in the way a person stirs when a dream has finished its kind visit. She blinked once and looked at him and then at the book on her lap and smiled with a little apologetic tilt that did not need to apologize. He told her that falling asleep while someone reads is a compliment that is better than any review, and she laughed softly and said that his voice had been like the room itself and that she had felt safe drifting. He closed the book and placed a slip of paper inside with a note that they might borrow it for an evening soon, then asked if she would like something warm to drink from the small kettle in the corner that the librarian had told him about. She said yes, and he walked to the corner and filled 2 cups with hot water and a squeeze of lemon and a bit of honey from a jar labeled for guests who read long. They sipped in silence for a minute and let waking arrive fully. Mira asked him to tell her the last sentence, and he repeated it slowly. "Time can stand still without stopping." And she nodded as if the sentence had set itself on a shelf inside her. They returned the books to the cart with a note to hold them for 3 days and thanked the librarian. At the door they paused to watch the rain thin to a fine veil that spoke of clearing. The librarian told them to come any time the weather asked for a quiet room, and Mira said the weather asked often. They laughed, and the librarian laughed with them. Outside, the air held that new taste the town earns after a good wash. A mix of wet leaves, clean brick, and sea salt. They walked under the umbrella more from habit than need, and the sky brightened in long, slow shapes. They drifted toward the cafe with the gentle aim of people who have time, and at the window saw that the lantern had been lit even in the day because the owner liked its company. The square of blue held a soft flame as if the sky had come inside for a rest. They stepped in and returned the umbrella to its place, and the bell was pleased to sound again. The owner looked at them and then at the library books in their hands and placed 2 cups on the counter before they could ask. She told them neighbors had been leaving small notes beside the lantern all morning. Nothing grand, only brief lines of thanks for the night at the tower and the way the market had felt like a room where everyone knew someone. Aiden and Mira stepped to the board and saw a cluster of cards that glowed with simple words. One said, "We walked home easier." Another said, "The lanterns made my son unafraid of the stairs." Another said, "The market cup made my morning kind." Aiden pinned a card that said, "Thank you for learning to be lights to each other," and drew a tiny clock face with the hands at 2 times at once, which made the owner laugh because she understood the joke. Mira pressed a small wet leaf she had carried from the library steps into the corner of the same card and wrote, "Slow rain, soft pages, good friends in this town." They sat by the fern and shared a plate with 2 slices of warm bread. The light through the window fell exactly where they had hoped it would on the lantern and on their table. They let the moment last without reaching for plans too quickly. When they spoke, it was only to say that the greenhouse could wait until tomorrow for the first hooks, and that tonight would be a night for listening rather than making. Aiden told her that reading aloud had felt like a kind of lantern. Mira told him that falling asleep had been a way of agreeing. They drank the last of their tea and sat without words again because silence had grown comfortable and wanted its share. Later they walked toward the hill where the greenhouse stood and did not climb, choosing instead to circle the base along a path that smelled of rosemary and wet earth. The sky opened to a pale evening and the clouds became thin islands. They stopped at a low wall and looked toward the pier where the water had laid itself down after its work and now resembled a sheet a careful hand had smoothed. He told her a memory of his grandmother reading him a book with pictures of clocks that did not match and how he had loved the idea that time could be kind if it chose to be. She told him a memory of her aunt reading on late summer afternoons while the greenhouse fans turned slow and how she had learned to nap in a chair by watching the way leaves keep their own hours. They returned to the cafe just as the owner lit the lantern again and placed a tiny card beside it with the words "Light Found" together in neat script. They stood in the doorway and watched the flame establish itself, the blue glass deepening as if to hold the glow, the white and green pieces on the frame taking a little color and sending it quietly back into the room. A neighbor passed and stopped and smiled and said that this looked like a story that had decided to live in a window. They agreed. They thanked the owner for hosting the symbol of the day. Then they moved toward the corner where they often said goodbye, their steps slow in the best sense, like the pace of a person carrying a teacup to a chair. At the corner, the street smelled faintly of paper and wool from rain drying, and the sky had that thin late brightness that seems to tell the mind that rest is near. They stood close and kept their voices low. Aiden thanked Mira for the library hour and for trusting his voice enough to carry her into sleep. Mira thanked him for reading as if time had decided to sit with them and for letting the room be the third person in their conversation. They decided that tomorrow they would begin the hooks and perhaps hang only one piece, the pale aqua with the bubble, and stop at once to let the moment settle. They promised no more than that because they had learned that promises like that hold. They said good night in a way that did not close anything, and then they walked home by paths that had learned their steps. In his room, Aiden placed the sketchbook on the table and opened to the drawing of the sleeping figure in the library chair. And he wrote one line beneath it. The room read to us too, and then he set down the pencil. He watched the cutting on the sill float and the root move a little as the air shifted, and he whispered that time could stand still for a moment if it wished. He blew out his candle and lay back. The town outside made the soft sounds it makes when a rain has finished and the night is clean and the sea remembers to breathe for everyone. He let those sounds lift him and carry him away the way a good sentence does, and he slept with the picture of a lamp shade, a folded book, and a square of blue glass that held light exactly as long as it was needed and not a